Professor fails student because of his skin color, but he had no idea who the boy's mother was. The halls of Westbridge University hummed with the excited chatter of students preparing for final exams. Among them walked Marcus Johnson, 22-year-old senior with dreams as big as his bright smile. His dark skin gleamed with a healthy glow, and his close-cropped hair was neatly trimmed, reflecting his meticulous nature. Marcus adjusted his backpack, filled to bursting with textbooks and notes, as he made his way to Professor William Hartley's office. As a straight-A student majoring in chemical engineering, Marcus had never had cause for concern when meeting with a professor. But today, uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He'd received an email from Professor Hartley the previous evening, requesting an urgent meeting regarding his final project. Comprehensive Analysis of Sustainable Energy Solutions, represented the culmination of Marcus's 4 years of hard work. He'd poured his heart and soul into it, staying up late into the night, sacrificing his social life, all to ensure it was nothing short of perfect. As Marcus approached the weathered oak door of Professor Hartley's office, he took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He knocked firmly, 3 short raps that echoed in the empty hallway. "Enter," came a gruff voice from within. Marcus stepped into the cluttered office, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through dusty Venetian blinds. Professor Hartley sat behind a massive desk, his steel-gray hair combed over a balding pate, wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose. At 65, William Hartley was an institution at Westbridge, known for his brilliant mind and his exacting standard. "Ah, Mr. Johnson," Professor Hartley said, not looking up from the papers strewn across his desk. "Sit down." Marcus lowered himself into a creaky wooden chair, his heart pounding. "You wanted to see me about my final project, sir?" Professor Hartley finally looked up, his pale blue eyes fixing Marcus with a stare that made him feel like a bug under a microscope. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, I've reviewed your project and I'm afraid I have some concerns." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Concerns? He'd triple-checked every calculation, cross-referenced every source. "What could possibly be wrong, sir?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Hartley leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Johnson, I've been teaching at this institution for over 4 decades. In that time, I've seen thousands of students come through my classroom. I've developed a keen sense for identifying genuine talent and original work." He paused, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Your project, while technically proficient, lacks the spark of originality I expect from my top students. It's derivative, shall we say?" Marcus felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "Derivative? But sir, I've worked incredibly hard on this project. Every idea, every analysis is my own." Professor Hartley's lips thinned into a disapproving line. "Come now, Mr. Johnson, let's not play games. We both know that this level of work is unusual for someone of your background." The words hung in the air between them, their implication unmistakable. Marcus felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "My background, sir?" "Yes, Mr. Johnson. Your cultural background." Professor Hartley's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than making a blatantly racist assumption. "I find it hard to believe that you could produce work of this caliber without outside assistance." Marcus's mind reeled. Was this really happening? In 2023 at one of the most prestigious universities in the country? "Professor Hartley," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "I assure you that every word, every calculation in that project is my own. I've maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout my time here at Westbridge. My work has always been exemplary." Professor Hartley waved a dismissive hand. "Grades can be misleading, Mr. Johnson. And let's be honest, the university has certain quotas to maintain. Standards have been known to slip in the name of diversity." Marcus felt as if he'd been slapped. The implication that he was some kind of diversity hire, that his achievements were somehow less valid because of the color of his skin, cut deep. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not fair. My work speaks for itself. I've earned my place here at Westbridge, just like every other student." Professor Hartley's expression hardened. "I'm afraid I disagree, Mr. Johnson. And as the professor of this course, my opinion is what matters. I cannot, in good conscience, pass a project that I believe to be fraudulent." The word fraudulent echoed in Marcus's ears. "You're failing me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid so, Mr. Johnson, and given the serious nature of academic dishonesty, I'll be recommending to the board that your degree be withheld pending a full investigation." Marcus felt as if the world was crumbling around him. 4 years of hard work, of sacrifices, of proving himself again and again, all hanging in the balance because of one man's prejudice. "Professor Hartley, please, this is a mistake. I can explain every aspect of my project, defend every conclusion. Just give me a chance." But Professor Hartley was already shuffling papers on his desk. Clear dismissal. "My decision is final, Mr. Johnson. You'll be notified of the hearing date in due course. That will be all." Marcus rose from his chair on shaky legs, his mind a whirlwind of shock, anger, and despair. As he reached for the door handle, Professor Hartley spoke again. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his tone almost kindly, "I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's about maintaining the integrity of this institution. Perhaps this will be a valuable lesson for you about knowing your place." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stumbled out of the office, barely aware of his surroundings as he made his way through the suddenly oppressive halls of the university he'd once loved. Outside, bright spring sunshine felt like a mockery of the darkness that had descended over Marcus's world. Collapsed onto a bench, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could this be happening? In this day and age, at a supposedly progressive institution like Westbridge? And what could he do about it? Was his word against Professor Hartley's, a respected, tenured professor with decades of experience? As the reality of his situation sank in, Marcus felt a resolve begin to form within him. Couldn't let this stand, not just for himself, but for every student of color who had ever been made to feel less than, who had their achievements questioned because of the color of their skin. Marcus straightened his back, wiping away the tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. This wasn't over. He would fight this injustice with every fiber of his being. He would prove Professor Hartley wrong, and in doing so, he would strike a blow against the insidious racism that still lurked in the hallowed halls of academia. As he stood, gathering his strength for the battle ahead, Marcus couldn't have known that this incident would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but would send shockwaves through Westbridge University and beyond. Fight for justice was just beginning, and Marcus Johnson was ready to stand up and be counted. Little did he know that the journey ahead would test him in ways he never imagined, forcing him to confront not just the prejudices of others, but his own beliefs about himself and the world around him. The path to justice would be long and fraught with challenges, but Marcus was determined to walk it, no matter the cost. As he walked away from the Humanities building, his mind already racing with plans and strategies, Marcus Johnson had no idea that he was about to become the catalyst for a movement that would shake Westbridge University to its very foundations. The following days passed in a blur for Marcus Johnson. The shock of Professor Hartley's accusation and the impending investigation hung over him like a dark cloud, coloring every aspect of his life. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned friends and classmates who had heard rumors of what had transpired. Marcus found himself withdrawing, spending hours in his small off-campus apartment, poring over his project notes and documentation. He was determined to prove beyond any doubt that his work was original and deserving of recognition. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after his meeting with Professor Hartley, that Marcus received an email that would change the course of events. The message was from Dr. Lydia Chen, the Dean of Student Affairs. "Mr. Johnson," email read, "I've been made aware of the serious allegations against you. I would like to meet with you to discuss this matter in person. Please come to my office tomorrow at 2 p.m. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Chen had a reputation for fairness and was known for her commitment to student welfare. Perhaps this was his chance to tell his side of the story. The next day, Marcus found himself sitting across from Dr. Chen in her spacious office. Unlike Professor Hartley's cluttered space, Dr. Chen's office was modern and minimalist, with large windows overlooking the campus quad. "Marcus," Dr. Chen began, her tone gentle but professional, I want you to know that we're taking the situation very seriously. An allegation of academic dishonesty is not something we take lightly, but neither is the possibility of unfair treatment of a student. Marcus nodded, throat tight. I understand, Dr. Chen. I want you to know that I categorically deny Professor Hartley's accusations. My work is entirely my own. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her dark eyes studying Marcus intently. Marcus, I have to ask, do you believe there was any element of racial bias in Professor Hartley's decision? The question hung in the air between them. Marcus hesitated, weighing his words carefully. He didn't want to cry racism without being absolutely certain, but he couldn't deny the implication in Professor Hartley's words. Dr. Chen, he said finally, Professor Hartley made several comments about my background and suggested that it was unusual for someone like me to produce work of this caliber. He even mentioned diversity quotas. I can't say for certain what was in his mind. Those comments felt discriminatory. Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. I see, she said, making a note on the pad in front of her. Marcus, given the nature of these allegations, both against you and potentially against Professor Hartley, we'll need to conduct a thorough investigation. This will involve reviewing your project, interviewing Professor Hartley, and possibly speaking with other students and faculty members. Marcus nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. At least he was being given a chance to prove his innocence. In the meantime, Dr. Chen continued, I'm going to recommend that your graduation be deferred pending the outcome of this investigation. I know that's not ideal, but it's standard procedure in cases like this. Marcus felt his heart sink. The thought of not graduating with his class, of having to explain to his parents why he wouldn't be walking across the stage to receive his diploma, was almost unbearable. But he knew he had no choice. I understand, he said, voice barely above a whisper. As Marcus left Dr. Chen's office, he felt as if he were walking in a daze. The campus around him, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and hostile. Every glance from a passing student or faculty member felt judgmental, as if they all knew his secret shame. But as he walked, a new emotion began to rise within him. Determination. He would not let Professor Hartley's prejudice define him. He would fight this injustice with every tool at his disposal. That evening, Marcus made 2 important phone calls. The first was to his parents, Robert and Angela Johnson. Telling them about the situation was one of the hardest things Marcus had ever done. He could hear the pain and anger in his father's voice, the disbelief in his mother's. We're coming up there, Angela declared, her tone brooking no argument. You shouldn't have to face this alone. The second call was to his best friend and fellow engineering student, Sarah Goldstein. Sarah listened in shocked silence as Marcus recounted what had happened. That's insane, she sputtered when he finished. Marcus, you're the most brilliant student in our class. Everyone knows that. There's no way your project isn't original. Try telling that to Professor Hartley, Marcus said bitterly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, Sarah said slowly, I think I might have an idea. Remember that study group we had for Hartley's midterm? I think I might have noticed something. As Sarah explained her idea, Marcus felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to potentially prove that Professor Hartley's bias extended beyond just him. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus's parents arrived, providing a solid wall of support as he navigated the treacherous waters of the university's investigation. They attended meetings with him, helped him organize his documentation, and provided a shoulder to cry on during his darkest moments. Meanwhile, Sarah had sprung into action, discreetly reaching out to other students of color who had taken Professor Hartley's classes over the years. Slowly but surely, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern of subtle discrimination, of higher standards applied to students of color, of offhand comments that made students feel less than. As the investigation progressed, Marcus found unexpected allies. Dr. Chen, true to her reputation, conducted a thorough and impartial inquiry. She interviewed dozens of students and faculty members, pored over years of grade records, and subjected Marcus's project to rigorous review by independent experts. But even as the investigation moved forward, Marcus faced new challenges. Word of the situation had spread throughout the campus, and opinions were sharply divided. Some students rallied around Marcus, organizing protests and petition drives demanding justice. Others, particularly those close to Professor Hartley, defended the professor vigorously, accusing Marcus of playing the race card to cover up his own academic shortcomings. The stress began to take its toll on Marcus. He lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and found himself jumping at every email notification, every knock on the door. The dream of graduation that had sustained him for 4 years now seemed like a distant mirage. It was during this difficult time that Marcus received an unexpected visit. He was studying in the library late one evening when an elderly African-American man approached his table. "Marcus Johnson?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Marcus looked up, startled. "Yes?" The man sat down across from him, his eyes kind but intense. "My name is Dr. James Baldwin. I was one of the first black professors here at Westbridge back in the 70s. I heard about what's happening with you and Professor Hartley." Marcus felt a surge of emotion. Here was someone who might truly understand what he was going through. Dr. Baldwin leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Son, I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight. What you're doing, standing up to injustice, demanding to be treated fairly, it's important. It's part of a long struggle that goes back generations." As Dr. Baldwin shared stories of his own experiences with discrimination in academia, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Here was living proof that it was possible to face prejudice and emerge stronger, to carve out a place in a world that often seemed determined to exclude people who looked like him. "Remember, Marcus," Dr. Baldwin said as he prepared to leave, "your fight isn't just for yourself. It's for every student of color who will come after you. Stay strong, stay focused, and know that you have more support than you realize." Those words would stay with Marcus in the difficult days to come. As the investigation neared its conclusion, tensions on campus reached a fever pitch. The case had become a flashpoint for larger discussions about racial bias in academia, about the challenges faced by students of color in predominantly white institutions. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he never could have anticipated. But as he prepared for the hearing that would determine his fate, and potentially the fate of countless other students, he drew strength from the support of his family, his friends, and unexpected allies like Dr. Baldwin. The day of the hearing dawned bright and clear. As Marcus walked into the imposing administration building, his parents on one side and Sarah on the other, he felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had done everything in his power, fight for justice, not just for himself, for all those who had faced similar discrimination. Little did Marcus know that the hearing would uncover revelations that would shake Westbridge University to its core, forcing a reckoning with long-buried truths and setting the stage for profound changes that would ripple far beyond the confines of campus. As the doors of the hearing room closed behind him, Marcus squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Fight for justice was far from over, but he was prepared to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. As the date of the hearing drew nearer, Westbridge University found itself divided. The case of Marcus Johnson versus Professor William Hartley had become a lightning rod for long-simmering tensions about race, privilege, and the true meaning of academic merit. The once peaceful campus quad had become a battleground of ideas. On one side, student activists rallied around Marcus, organizing sit-ins and holding up signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," and "End racial bias in academia." On the other, a smaller but vocal group defended Professor Hartley, arguing that accusations of racism were being used to undermine academic standards. Marcus found himself caught in the middle of this storm, trying to maintain his focus on the upcoming hearing while navigating the increasingly charged atmosphere on campus. One crisp autumn morning, as Marcus made his way to the library, found his path blocked by a group of students he recognized as some of Professor Hartley's staunchest defenders. "Hey, Johnson," one of them called out, his tone mocking. "Enjoying your 15 minutes of fame? Must be nice to play the victim card." Marcus felt his fists clench at his sides, but he took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Baldwin's advice to stay focused on what really mattered. He tried to sidestep the group, but they moved to surround him. "What's the matter?" another taunted. "Can't defend yourself without crying racism?" Just as Marcus was considering how to extricate himself from the situation without escalating it, a voice rang out across the quad. "Hey, leave him alone." Marcus turned to see Sarah jogging towards them, her face flushed with anger. She pushed her way through the group to stand beside Marcus, glaring at his harassers. "Don't you have anything better to do than harass someone who's already going through hell?" he demanded. "Or are you just upset that Marcus is 10 times the student you'll ever be, even with people like Hartley trying to hold him back?" The group, taken aback by Sarah's fierce defense, began to disperse, muttering under their breath. As they walked away, Marcus turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that." Sarah's expression softened. "Of course I did. You're my best friend, Marcus, and you're not alone in this fight." As they walked together towards the library, Marcus felt a warmth in his chest. In the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty, it was comforting to know he had allies like Sarah. But the incident in the quad was just one of many challenges Marcus faced as the hearing approached. The stress was taking a toll on him, physically and emotionally. He'd lost weight, dark circles had formed under his eyes from sleepless nights spent preparing his defense, and he found himself jumping at every unexpected noise. His parents, still in town to support him, were becoming increasingly worried. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table in Marcus's small apartment, Angela reached out to touch her son's hand. "Marcus, honey," she said gently, "we're worried about you. You're running yourself into the ground." Marcus sighed, pushing his barely touched food around his plate. "I have to be prepared, Mom. Everything's riding on this hearing." Robert Johnson set down his fork, fixing his son with a steady gaze. "Son, being prepared is one thing, but you won't be any good to yourself or anyone else if you collapse from exhaustion. You need to take care of yourself too." Marcus knew his parents were right, but the weight of what was at stake felt overwhelming. It wasn't just about his degree anymore. He'd become a symbol for so many students of color who had faced similar discrimination. Couldn't let them down. As if reading his thoughts, Angela squeezed his hand. "Marcus, remember what Dr. Baldwin told you. This fight is bigger than just you, but that also means you don't have to carry the whole burden alone. Let us help you. Let your friends help you." Her words struck a chord in Marcus. He'd been so focused on proving himself and being strong in the face of adversity that he'd forgotten the importance of leaning on his support system. The next day, Marcus took a small but significant step. He reached out to the campus counseling center, scheduling an appointment with a therapist. It was a difficult decision. There was still a stigma around mental health in many communities of color. But Marcus knew he needed help processing everything he was going through. Dr. Yolanda Ramirez, a kind-faced Latina woman in her 40s, provided a safe space for Marcus to voice his fears and frustration. In their sessions, he was able to admit how scared he was, not just of losing his degree, but of letting down everyone who believed in him. "Marcus," Dr. Ramirez said during one particularly emotional session, "it's natural to feel the weight of expectations. But remember, you're not responsible for fixing centuries of systemic racism. Your job is to tell your truth and stand up for what's right. Whatever the outcome, you've already shown immense courage in fighting this battle." These sessions, combined with the unwavering support of his parents and friends, helped Marcus find a balance. He was still working hard to prepare for the hearing, but he was also taking time to care for his mental and physical health. As the weeks passed, Marcus's story began to attract attention beyond the confines of Westbridge. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines in national publications. The case was held up as an example of the ongoing struggle against racial bias in higher education. This increased attention brought new pressures. Marcus found himself fielding calls from journalists and fielding interview requests. Some saw him as a hero, a young man bravely standing up against injustice. Others painted him as a troublemaker, someone using accusations of racism to cover up his own academic shortcuts. Through it all, Marcus tried to stay focused on what really mattered: proving his innocence and exposing the systemic biases that had allowed someone like Professor Hartley to discriminate against students of color for years. One afternoon, about a week before the hearing, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was studying in his apartment when there was a knock at the door. Opening it, he was surprised to see a young woman he didn't recognize. "Are you Marcus Johnson?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus nodded, confused. "My name is Aisha Patel," she said. I graduated from Westbridge 3 years ago. I had Professor Hartley for my senior project and, well, I think I might have information that could help your case." As Aisha shared her story, one that bore striking similarities to Marcus's own experience, he felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was painful to hear that others had suffered similar discrimination. On the other, Aisha's testimony could be crucial in proving a pattern of behavior from Professor Hartley. After Aisha left, promising to speak with Dr. Chen and provide a statement for the hearing, Marcus sat in stunned silence. How many other students had stories like Aisha's? How long had this been going on? That night, as Marcus lay in bed, unable to sleep, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. The years of hard work, the dreams of becoming an engineer, the pride he'd felt in being accepted to Westbridge. He thought about his parents, who had sacrificed so much to give him this opportunity. He thought about Sarah, standing up to his harassers in the quad. He thought about Dr. Baldwin, reminding him of the long struggle for equality that had paved the way for his own education. And he thought about Professor Hartley. What made a man decide that the color of someone's skin determined their intelligence or worth? How many promising careers had been derailed by his prejudice? As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, Marcus made a decision. Whatever the outcome of the hearing, he would not let this experience embitter him. Instead, he would use it as fuel to fight for change, to ensure that future students of color wouldn't have to face the same challenges he had. With this resolution firm in his mind, Marcus finally drifted off to sleep. In just a few days, he would face the hearing that could determine the course of his future. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, secure in the knowledge that he had truth and justice on his side. Little did Marcus know that the hearing would uncover secrets and lies that would shake Westbridge University to its very foundations, forcing a reckoning that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. As the sun rose over the Westbridge campus, casting long shadows across the quad, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge long-held beliefs, expose hidden prejudices, and ultimately lead to a reckoning that would ripple through the entire academic community. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and crisp, a beautiful autumn day that belied the tension gripping the Westbridge campus. Marcus Johnson stood before the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. His reflection showed a young man who had aged years in the span of a few months. His face was leaner, his eyes shadowed with the weight of his experiences, but there was a determined set to his jaw that spoke of inner strength. A gentle knock at the door preceded his mother's entrance. Angela Johnson's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern as she looked at her son. "You ready, baby?" Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mom." The Johnson family made their way to the imposing administration building where the hearing would take place. As they approached, Marcus saw a sight that made his heart swell. A crowd of students and faculty members had gathered, holding signs of support and chanting "Justice for Marcus." Among them, he spotted Sarah, Dr. Baldwin, and many others who had stood by him throughout this ordeal. Inside the building, the hearing room was a study in contrast. On one side sat Marcus with his parents, Sarah and their lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Torres, who had taken on the case pro bono after hearing about it in the news. On the other side was Professor Hartley, looking pale and drawn, flanked by his own legal representation and a few senior faculty members who had come to support him. At the head of the room sat the disciplinary committee, a panel of 5 administrators and faculty members, Dr. Chen presiding. The tension in the air was palpable as Dr. Chen called the hearing to order. "We are here today," she began, her voice steady and clear, "to address the allegations of academic dishonesty against Marcus Johnson as well as the counter-allegations of racial discrimination against Professor William Hartley. This hearing will determine not only Mr. Johnson's academic future, also the integrity of our institution. I urge everyone present to approach these proceedings with the seriousness and respect they deserve. What followed was a grueling day of testimonies, evidence presentations, and intense questioning. Marcus presented his project in meticulous detail, explaining every calculation and conclusion with a clarity that impressed even his detractors. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady, bolstered by the supportive presence of his family and friends. Professor Hartley, when it was his turn to speak, stuck to his original stance. He insisted that the quality of Marcus's work was simply not possible, or someone of his background, without outside help. But as he spoke, there was a noticeable discomfort in his demeanor, a shifting of eyes that suggested he was less certain than he appeared. The turning point came when Sarah took the stand. With careful precision, she presented her findings from the study group, a statistical analysis showing a clear pattern of Professor Hartley rating students of color more harshly than their white peers, even when their work was of equal or superior quality. A murmur ran through the room as Sarah presented her evidence. Professor Hartley's face grew increasingly pale, while some members of the disciplinary committee exchanged troubled glances. But the true bombshell came from an unexpected source. As the hearing was nearing its end, the door to the room burst open and a middle-aged white woman rushed in, out of breath and clutching a stack of papers. "I'm sorry I'm late," she gasped. "My name is Margaret Hartley. I'm William's ex-wife, and I have something the committee needs to see." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Professor Hartley half rose from his seat, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Dr. Chen called for order, then addressed the newcomer. "Mrs. Hartley, this is highly irregular. What is it you wish to present to the committee?" Margaret Hartley approached the committee, her hands shaking slightly as she handed over the papers she'd brought. "These are private journals and emails from my ex-husband," she explained. "They show a long history of racist beliefs and actions, including deliberate discrimination against students of color." As the committee members began to review the documents, Professor Hartley's composure finally cracked. "You had no right," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "Those were private." "No, William," Margaret replied, her voice sad but firm. "You lost the right to privacy when you used your position to hurt innocent students. I couldn't stay silent anymore." What followed was a flurry of activity as the committee pored over the new evidence. Marcus sat in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe this unexpected turn of events. Sarah squeezed his hand supportively, while his parents exchanged looks of cautious hope. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Chen called the hearing back to order. Her face was grave as she addressed the room. "In light of this new evidence, and considering all the testimony we've heard today, this committee finds the allegations against Marcus Johnson to be completely unfounded. Mr. Johnson, your project has been independently verified as original and of exceptional quality. You will receive full credit, and this incident will be expunged from your record." A cheer went up from Marcus's supporters, but Dr. Chen wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice hardening, "we find Professor William Hartley's actions to be in gross violation of our institution's principles and policies. Professor Hartley, you are hereby terminated from your position at Westbridge University, effective immediately. Full investigation into your past grading practices will be conducted, and any students found to have been unfairly evaluated will have their grades reviewed and adjusted as necessary." The room erupted into chaos. Professor Hartley shouted protests as he was escorted out, while Marcus found himself enveloped in a group hug by his parents and Sarah, all of them crying tears of relief and joy. As the initial shock began to wear off, Marcus made his way over to Margaret Hartley, who stood alone in a corner of the room, looking drained but relieved. "Mrs. Hartley," he said softly, "can't thank you enough for what you did. It must have been incredibly difficult." Margaret gave him a sad smile. "It was long overdue, Marcus. I'm just sorry I didn't have the courage to do it sooner. Maybe if I had, other students wouldn't have had to go through what you did." As Marcus left the hearing room, stepping out into the late afternoon sunlight, he felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as news of the decision spread. Marcus found himself lifted onto the shoulders of his fellow students, their faces beaming with triumph and vindication. But even in this moment of victory, Marcus knew that the story wasn't over. Yes, justice had been served in his case, but what about all the other students who face discrimination every day? What about the systemic issues that allowed someone like Professor Hartley to abuse his power for so long? As he was set back down on his feet, Marcus locked eyes with Dr. Baldwin in the crowd. The older man gave him a nod of pride and encouragement, as if to say, "The real work begins now." Marcus straightened his shoulders, a new sense of purpose filling him. He had fought for his own justice, yes, but now he had the opportunity and the responsibility, fight for something bigger. To use his experience, his voice, push for real lasting change at Westbridge and beyond. The sun was setting over the campus, casting long shadows across the quad, as Marcus Johnson, surrounded by his supporters, took the first steps towards a future he could never have imagined just a few months ago. Future where he would not only pursue his dreams of becoming an engineer, but would also become an advocate for equality and justice in academia. The battle had been won. The war against discrimination and prejudice was far from over, and Marcus was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the truth, supported by allies, and driven by a determination to ensure that no other student would have to face what he had endured. As night fell over Westbridge University, the echoes of the day's events continued to reverberate. Change was coming, and Marcus Johnson would be at the forefront of it. 5 years had passed since that fateful hearing at Westbridge University. The campus, once a battleground of tension and division, had undergone a remarkable transformation. On this bright spring morning, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in the grand auditorium, looking out over a sea of faces, students, faculty, and administrators from universities across the country. The occasion was the inaugural National Conference on Equity in Higher Education, and Marcus, now 27, was the keynote speaker. As he adjusted the microphone, his eyes found familiar faces in the crowd. His parents, beaming with pride. Sarah, now a successful engineer herself. Dr. Baldwin, his hair a little grayer, but his eyes as sharp as ever. 5 years ago, Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, I stood in a hearing room on this very campus, fighting not just for my degree, but for my dignity. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that justice can prevail, and that our institutions of higher learning can and must do better. A hush fell over the auditorium as Marcus recounted his story. The cruel dismissal by Professor Hartley, the investigation, the hearing, and the unexpected revelations that had turned the tide. But he didn't stop there. He spoke of the aftermath, of the hard work and dedication that had gone into transforming Westbridge University. In the weeks and months following the hearing, Westbridge had been forced to confront its deep-seated issues with racial bias. The investigation into Professor Hartley's past grading practices had uncovered dozens of cases of discrimination, leading to a massive undertaking to review and adjust grades going back nearly 2 decades. But more than that, the university had embarked on a comprehensive overhaul of its policies and culture. New diversity and inclusion training programs were implemented for all faculty and staff. Curriculum was reviewed and expanded to include more diverse perspectives and experiences. A student-led equity council was established to give voice to concerns and ideas from the student body. Marcus had been at the forefront of many of these changes. After graduating with honors, he had been invited to join a special task force dedicated to implementing and overseeing the new initiative. His engineering career had taken a back seat as he discovered a new passion, advocating for equity in education. The transformation we've seen at Westbridge is just the beginning, Marcus continued, voice passionate. We've proven that with dedication, courage, and a commitment to justice, we can create institutions that truly serve all students, regardless of their race, background, or circumstance. As Marcus spoke, couldn't help but reflect on the personal journey he'd undergone. The shy, self-doubting student who had sat in Professor Hartley's office, crushed by an unjust accusation, seemed like a different person now. In fighting for his rights, in standing up against discrimination, Marcus had discovered a strength and purpose he never knew he possessed. He thought about the many students he'd mentored over the past few years, young men and women of color who had faced their own struggles with bias and discrimination. He remembered the light that would come into their eyes when they realized they weren't alone, that they had allies in their fight for equality. "But our work is far from over," Marcus said, his tone growing serious. "What happened at Westbridge is not unique. Across the country, students of color continue to face barriers and biases that their white peers do not. It's up to all of us, students, educators, administrators, to commit ourselves to ongoing change." As he concluded his speech, Marcus shared his vision for the future where every student, regardless of their race or background, had an equal opportunity to pursue their dreams and reach their full potential. The applause that followed was thunderous. As Marcus stepped down from the podium, he was engulfed in a sea of well-wishers. But his eyes sought out three familiar faces in the crowd. Dr. Chen, now the president of Westbridge University, approached first. "Marcus," she said, her voice warm with pride, "you continue to inspire us all. The changes you've helped bring about at Westbridge have become a model for universities across the nation." Next came Sarah, who enveloped Marcus in a tight hug. "Who would have thought," she said with a grin, "that my nerdy best friend would become a national leader in educational equity?" Marcus laughed, returning the hug. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. Your support, your data analysis, you were there from the beginning." Finally, Marcus's parents reached him. Angela and Robert Johnson embraced their son, tears shining in their eyes. "We are so proud of you, baby," Angela whispered. "You've turned a terrible experience into something beautiful and powerful." As the conference continued, Marcus found himself reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about Professor Hartley, whose actions had set this all in motion. Last he'd heard, the former professor was working with an anti-racism organization, using his story as a cautionary tale and working to educate others about the insidious nature of racial bias. He thought about Margaret Hartley, whose courage in coming forward had been a turning point. She had become an unlikely ally in the fight for equity, speaking out about the importance of confronting racism, even when it came from those closest to us. But mostly, Marcus thought about the future. Conference was just the beginning. Universities from across the country were looking to Westbridge as a model for change. There was talk of national legislation to address systemic racism in higher education. The movement that had started with one unjust grade was growing into something much larger. Later that evening, as Marcus stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the city, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, fear, of exhaustion. Standing up for what was right, fighting for justice, it had transformed not just Westbridge, not just himself, but had sparked a national conversation about race and equity in education. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Marcus made a silent vow. He would continue this fight, continue to push for change, for as long as it took. Because every student deserved the chance to pursue their dreams, free from the burden of discrimination and bias. Marcus Johnson, once a victim of racial prejudice, had become a beacon of hope and a catalyst for change. His story was far from over, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Armed with knowledge, fueled by passion, and supported by a growing movement of allies, he was prepared to continue the long journey towards true equity in education. As night fell over the city, Marcus turned back to his room, his mind already racing with plans for the future. The conference was just the beginning. There were more battles to fight, more minds to change, more institutions to transform. The echoes of injustice that had once threatened to derail Marcus's future had become a rallying cry for change. And Marcus Johnson was ready to answer that call, for as long as it took, until every student, regardless of their race or background, had the opportunity to reach for the stars and achieve their dreams.